fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and we got Mr. Joe Goldberg in the house.
I'm in the house. I was just outside shoveling. I'm glad I'm back in the house because it is cold outside, baby.
Yeah. Well, it's good for you, you know.
Yeah.
Good for your
13
health.
wind chill, yeah.
A good thing I'm up in Canada where it's
where it's warm.
It's like warm. I can't figure that out. How come it's warm in Canada and it's cold down there? I don't know. Anyway, that's beyond my scope.
It's probably the heat from the fires in L.A., and that's no joke.
Yeah, and that's terrible thing.
Yeah.
It's
awful, tragedy.
I feel.
Well, we all have writer friends out there, so it's just tragic.
It's just it's insane. It's awful. But wish them the best. And then, speaking of tragedy, we've got a writer.
Or murder tragedy. Yeah.
Now, he's got a new book coming out. It's called Blood and the Badge. It's the Mafia, 2 killer cops, and a scandal that shocked the nation. Michael Cannell, thank you for being here.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
Gentlemen,
who walked in, right?
Well, listen, Michael, you've got quite the history. It looks like you were a New York Times editor, and so why the change into a book like this? Like, why are you writing kind of true crime, mafia, and all that? What drew you into this story?
Well, I didn't set out in life to be a mafia writer, but here I am. I wrote a book that came out 3 or 4 years ago called A Brotherhood Betrayed, which was about Murder Incorporated, the assassination arm of the Mafia in the 1930s and 40s. And so I kind of inhabited this Mafia space, and I became aware of this story that takes place in the late 80s and early 90s about 2 corrupt cops who were secretly on the Mafia payroll, 2 decorated, high-ranking detectives who were moonlighting for the mob, and they were feeding the Lucchese crime family sensitive police information, whose phones were tapped, who was about to be arrested, who was under investigation, but most importantly, who was a rat, who was a squealer, who in the Mafia was secretly cooperating with the government. And in those cases where they identified the rats, they would help the Mafia to facilitate the assassination of the rats. So these were bad guys, and they were involved in more than a dozen murders, and in at least one case that pulled the trigger themselves.
When you get into a story like this, you're dealing with a lot of, let's say bad guys. Like I do true crime myself a lot, but not quite. I never touched the Mafia, and I never touched like a lot of these, like corruption or police and things like that. How do you go around, or how do you approach the characters or the people that are involved in the story?
Well, there are FBI files, as you know. I found them to be surprisingly unhelpful. Trial transcripts are, to me, it's like reading. It just makes fascinating reading. All those people who go onto the witness stand and tell their story in their own words. More than anything, it was the people who worked on the investigations themselves, the FBI agents, the detectives, the DEA agents. They wouldn't have talked to me 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but now a little time has passed. They're almost all retired. The 2 corrupt cops in question have passed away. And so these detectives and other law enforcement figures I think they trusted me, and they were willing to talk about their experiences, and it was really an amazing experience for me because these stories just started to come out of them one after another, things they had never talked to anybody about, including their own families in some cases. So I was the happy recipient of a lot of a lot of history that nobody had ever heard before.
Hey, Michael, how did these guys get away with it? I have a brother who's a former police chief. I have a nephew who's FBI forever. I mean, it's a brotherhood, I know, but how did two New York police officers get away with this for so long and beyond?
It's amazing. I mean, they were helping to commit murders for the mob, and they got away with it for more than a decade. At one point, the main character in this story, Louis Eppolito, was caught passing a police file to a Sicilian drug smuggler named Rosario Gambino. The police had raided Gambino's home in New Jersey, and they found that Gambino had in his possession his own police file. So how did he get it? They found that Louis Eppolito, the detective, they found his fingerprints on the file. So not surprisingly, Eppolito went before Internal Affairs. But unbelievably, Internal Affairs dismissed the case. They acquitted him. Not only did they acquit him, but they promoted him. And then they invited him to pick his own precinct to go work in.
How?
Why did that happen? I mean, I think nobody knows the exact answer to that, and they never will. But I think the answer is that the NYPD at that point was weary of corruption scandals and tired of headlines in the Daily News and the New York Post about police corruption, and so they kind of swept it under the rug and they let him go. But that was a chance to get somebody who went on to do a lot of bad things.
Well, you know, when you deal with these kinds of stories and you kind of read and go through the awful things that they did, does that affect you as a person, as a writer? Like, is it hard to wrap yourself around some of the emotions? There's
a lot of extremely grisly and graphic stuff in this book. I don't like violence in movies, and I don't like it in television. Certainly don't like it in real life. Somehow when it's on the printed page, it doesn't bother me. And if you're writing a book, I think you have to do that with the awareness that you're competing for the reader's attention. You're competing with TikTok. You know, you're competing with Netflix. So in a way, I did feel as I worked on this book, I felt like the scenes where a body was dumped in Jamaica Bay in a metal tool locker, or, you know, somebody is tortured in a basement. I felt in a perverse kind of way like those were working for me, I hope, because I'm trying to keep the reader's attention.
Right. Is that kind of what helped make your decision on what you included in the story?
No, not really. I mean, that's a good question. No, I didn't craft the story around the violent episodes. I didn't try to, cultivate the violent episodes just for the sake of the violence. I really tried to just tell the story straight. And unavoidably, this story involves a lot of gruesome stuff because the Mafia at that time, the late 80s, early 90s, things were falling apart for them. There were a lot of people who flipped, a lot of people betrayed their friends, a lot of informants were killed. It was a bloodbath. So I didn't particularly have to go looking for violence. The violence was right there in the story.
Hey, Michael, even in the course of your books, the world of the Mafia has changed from being the Mafia to whatever they are now, not quite as powerful. How does that impact the storytelling you need to do from the all-powerful, from before The Godfather? Let's go way back. Let's go back to Edward G. Robinson and Cagney and that crowd. How do you change your writing from then to stuff you're doing now?
Well, the Mafia of the time period that I'm writing about was it was the last gasp of the old Mafia. It was still 5 crime families in New York ruled by bosses and underbosses and consiglieri, and you were supposed to follow the rules of what they called omerta, which was the idea that you loyalty to the Mafia above all else. But it was falling apart in that period. And so why was it falling apart? It was falling apart partially because a lot of drug money flooded into the mafia, and the younger generation of mobsters were more out for themselves. They were less about the hierarchy and the organization and more about what the mafia could do for them. And more than anything, the reason that it was falling apart was that Rudy Giuliani and other prosecutors were using the RICO laws to bust the mob. So in the old days, the police could grab the lower rung guys, the soldiers, no problem. But as soon as they arrested them, somebody else would take their place. They could never get the bosses, right? You know that old story about how Al Capone was busted for tax evasion? I mean, that's because they couldn't arrest him for pulling the trigger because he didn't pull the trigger. You know, he had other people to pull the trigger. But Rudy Giuliani used the RICO law. The RICO laws were the big game changer. And now they could round everybody up who was part of the conspiracy, part of the organization. And so this period in the early 90s was an unstable period, and people were betraying each other like crazy. And the two corrupt cops that I'm writing about, in a way, were a lifeline for a lot of the mafia figures because they relied on them for information. They relied on them for help to identify the betrayers.
Did you have a lot of first source interviews that you could do with, say, police, former or current mafia people, no matter how you define them?
I did speak to a couple of mafia people, including Sammy the Bull Gravano, who is perhaps the most prominent and well-known mobster still around. I also spoke to a Colombo family soldier who was nice to drive around Brooklyn with me one day, and we stopped at an old wise guy hangout called Cafe Italia in Bensonhurst, and we drank a lot of espresso. I didn't sleep for about 2 nights after that. And he told me a lot of stories, and it was really interesting to drive around the old neighborhood with him.
So what do you think about the mafia that people get wrong? Are there things that in general, when we watch these movies and hear these stories and stuff, that we have totally the wrong idea?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one thing that comes to mind, it's not particularly represented in say, The Sopranos, is how disciplined the mafia used to be. I mean, it was really run like the military. I mean, there were rules, and they followed the rules just as much as the police followed their rules. And they were, sounds funny to say it, but in a way they were risk averse. They didn't want to take risks, but they did it when they had to. There were exceptions to that, of course. I describe in the book this group called the DeMeo crew, who were out in Flatlands, Brooklyn, and they were they were like if you took. They're like the Manson family. It's like if you took a dozen serial killers and put them into one social club. That's what they were like. They killed something like 75 people, but detectives have told me unofficially that their body count was probably more like 200.
Well, I know a lot of this happened a while ago, but do you ever worry about any backlash or anybody that's still around that might not like that you've written a book in this subject?
No, I don't feel unsafe, partially for the reason that you mentioned. I think that a lot of this is history now. The wise guys are still out there, and they're, I think, running gambling rackets, and they're loan sharking. But violence isn't their stock in trade in the way that it used to be. And part of that is simply because of the proliferation of security cameras. You can't abduct somebody on a Brooklyn street anymore without it being caught on film. And so that kind of changed things. I did agree to change the names of a handful of people in the book because they were police informants and their role as police informants had never been revealed before. And so for their safety, I agreed to change their names. If I hadn't, there is reason to believe that they would have been endangered. But I don't feel unsafe.
Right. Well, we've got one of them on the line right now. Right?
Yeah. Keep my head down.
Yeah.
Mike, let me ask you a question. Is this book a sort of a police book? Is it a mafia book? Is it a New York environmental book? What angle did you start off with to put this thing together? I know you're telling the story, but is there a hero somewhere along in here? Who's really the bad guys?
Well, we certainly know who the bad guys are. The bad guys are these two cops, one of whom was born into a mafia family, and his world, was filled with bad guys. I think there is a hero. These two detectives appeared to have gotten away with all of this, and they retired. They took their generous police pensions, and they both moved to Las Vegas. And oddly enough, they moved across the street from each other in a subdivision on the outskirts of Las Vegas. So why did they live across the street from each other? I think it's because they were keeping an eye on each other. Particularly, Stephen Caracappa was keeping an eye on his partner, Louis Eppolito, because he was afraid Louis Eppolito was kind of a loudmouth, and he was afraid that Louis Eppolito was going to get them into trouble, which is in fact what happened. The hero of this story is a detective named Tommy Dades, who was set to retire. He was winding down his career, and he stumbled into some evidence about these two. He got a phone call from the mother of one of their victims who had figured out who they were. Now, she was herself from a mafia family. She didn't trust the FBI, but she trusted Tommy. Tommy had investigated the death of one of her two sons. Her two sons were both killed. She trusted Tommy. Tommy had a special way with the mothers. He really cultivated the mothers of both the perpetrators and the victims. And so she called Tommy and she shared what she knew with Tommy. Tommy took that information to the Brooklyn DA's office, and they asked him to begin an investigation, and that was the beginning of the end for Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa.
When a reader reads this book, there might not be an intended subtext, but a lot of times it comes out organically in a true story like this. Is there something you're hoping that readers take away from the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't set out to write this book with any message in mind or any lesson. I really just was interested in it as a story, as a kind of cinematic, hopefully gripping story. I guess one thing that comes to mind is that we think of these bad guys as bad guys, and they were pretty bad. But a lot of the people in the mafia, they had a humanity, and they were born into this life, and they often didn't particularly choose it. The mafia was kind of it's what was happening in their neighborhoods, and they were recruited. And once they were in it, it's virtually impossible to get out of it. So I guess that's what comes to mind, is that a lot of these figures are, I don't want to excuse their many crimes, but on some level I do have some sympathy for them.
Did the process of writing this book change you in some way?
Well, it changed me in the following way. I became, I worked at the New York Times, where you're not supposed to be friends with your sources. You keep a distance between yourself and the sources. I did the opposite in this. I became really good friends with these retired detectives who talked to me, particularly Tommy Dades, who I described earlier. Tommy and I we're on the phone with each other all the time, and it's just been a real revelation to me to get to know him and the other detectives and the way they lived. Tommy grew up under the toughest circumstances in the toughest neighborhood in Brooklyn, and he's just an amazing person. He didn't have a father. He was raised by a single mother. He once said to me, if you don't have a father, you find one on the streets. And that's what he did. He found a father on the streets. The father happened to be in law enforcement, but Tommy could very easily have been a mobster himself. The father he could have found could have been in the underworld. So all of that has really opened my eyes to a New York that I never knew.
Hey, Michael, what's the next for the Mafia? Is it going to be around forever? Is the Michael Cannell 50 years from now going to be writing about the current activities of the Mafia, or what's the story here?
I don't know. I mean, I'm working on a proposal for another Mafia book now, but you wonder, what does the Mafia go on forever? I mean, it's been with us since, as we know it now, it's been with us since the 1930s, and people ask me about this. What is the Mafia like now? And I mentioned that they're still out there. I don't know anything about the Russian Mafia in Brooklyn, but I bet those are some serious guys. So, organized crime, I think to some degree, is probably with us forever.
Yeah, it'll probably evolve, right, to survive, change throughout times, I would guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it evolves. I think it changes. It used to be about booze during Prohibition, and then then in the 80s it was about drugs, and I think it'll be about something else tomorrow.
It's just the ethnicities that are running it are changing.
Yeah.
Right? They continue to change.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Wow. It's a pretty amazing story. What's next? You've got the proposal in? Is there other things in the works? Where are you at now?
No, I'm working on a proposal about a Mafia story that takes place just slightly after this one, in the early to mid 90s, and luckily for me, the appetite for Mafia stories seems to be insatiable. The Mafia is like the gift that keeps on giving.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do people love Mafia? Like, why does The Sopranos do so well, and why do people still admire Capone to an extent, which is kind of crazy in a way, because they're not good people in a lot of ways. Trying to be nice. So, what's the?
I don't know. I think about that all the time. I wish I had a really smart answer to that. It is something about the dark glamour of the anti-hero. I think about those old westerns, the old western movies, the John Wayne type movies, and there was the anti-heroes in there, and then somehow the Mafia took over the role of anti-heroes, and it seems to me like each generation reinvents the Mafia story. There was the old black and white movies, and then there was The Godfather, and there was Goodfellas and Boardwalk Empire and The Sopranos. It just seems to be reinvented over and over again. It's like each generation wants to tell the same story, give it its own spin. And I don't know, on some level, it's very American story. It's about immigration. It's about assimilating. We're attracted, we rooted for Tony Soprano, even though he was not a good guy. I wish I had an answer for that.
I got the answer. Is to keep Robert De Niro working in the movie industry.
Well,
he has another one coming out, right?
There's one coming out in March, so I think you're right.
Yeah.
Wow, there you go. The whole business. Well, maybe he'll star in one of your books.
I would like that.
Yeah. Well, if he doesn't, Joe's available.
Yeah, I got friends.
Yeah. just in case you're interested, in that appeal that he has.
Okay.
So that's great. So let's talk about how people can contact you. Or do you like to interact with readers and people that are interested in your book? Do you have a website? Do you have social media? Let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I have a website. It's michaelcannell.com, and Cannell is spelled Cannell. People can find my email there. I love to hear from people. I'm very thick-skinned about this. If people don't like the book, I'd like to hear about that too. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever we call it now, Michael Cannell. So I would say be in touch. I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, you can always send one of your mob buddies after them if they write too bad of a review.
That's exactly.
Oh, he's never heard that before.
Yeah. Well, anyway, well, that's it. So. What was the biggest surprise when you're doing this whole process and meeting people and writing and all that stuff? Was there a certain story or thing that happened that totally blew you away?
I mean, one of the things that really surprised me was how the mobsters and the cops all knew each other, and they were friends to this day. They grew up in the same neighborhoods. They dated the same girls. They went to the same schools. The families were intermarried. Tommy Dades, who I mentioned before, really kind of broke this case, but he would be investigating mobsters all day long, and then at night he would go to a bar and drink a beer with the mobsters that he was investigating. It was kind of amazing that, in that way. They really were, and as I said earlier, Tommy could easily have gone into a life of crime, and many of the mobsters could have just as easily become cops. So it was a little arbitrary as to who was on which team.
Oh, pretty amazing. And maybe that's why there's such popularity in it. It's maybe the respect, the rules, like you were talking about, that the way they do things, there are systems or structure to it,
Yeah, I mean the old school mafia was very regimented and played by very particular rules and enforced them. You had better follow those rules or else.
Now the book, it's called Blood and the Badge. It's the Mafia, 2 killer cops, and a scandal that shocked the nation. And the author's been with us, Michael Cannell. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Fun to talk to you guys.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.